Hello and welcome to the fourth edition of our Zoom Q&As. I am Dylan Rosenblatt, the Governor's Office reporter for the Arizona Capital Times, and today I'm joined by Joel Edman, who is the Executive Director of the Arizona Advocacy Network. Hello, Joel. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Dylan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let's get right started. Can you briefly explain what exactly the Arizona Advocacy Network is and what you do specifically for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So Arizona Advocacy Network and Arizona Advocacy Foundation, we work to protect democracy here in Arizona. And so for us, that means protecting the right to vote, making sure every voter has meaningful access to the ballot in normal times and during a global pandemic. It means working to limit the influence of big money in our politics and protecting a fair and independent judiciary. And we do that work down at the state capitol. We work very closely with our elections officials across the state, and we work in court when we need to, taking matters into litigation. But in all of those arenas, our main focus is making sure we've got a democracy that works for the people of Arizona.
So how have things changed for you since the pandemic hit? I know obviously, like myself included, several other workers around the state and country have been forced to work at home if they're lucky enough to be able to continue working right now. Obviously, like, you have to do a lot of field work. Like you said, you're in courts. How has that changed since the pandemic hit?
Yeah, it's obviously, like a lot of folks, or well, everybody really, completely disrupted our work in some ways, and that, we're all working from home and fortunate to be able to do that. One big change is that, this is my fancy attire now, no more dressing up to go to the Capitol, anything like that. But one way this is really impacting our work is we're, as I said, working closely with elections officials to see how they're adjusting to the pandemic and how elections are going to be administered all across the state, and adjusting our own plans to protect those elections. Typically, every election, and this election's no different, we're part of the nonpartisan election protection coalition in Arizona that also includes our Native Vote election protection program, the One Arizona Coalition, All Voting is Local, the League of Women Voters, and other partners. And traditionally, we would have people out at polling places, interacting very closely with voters, making sure that their questions are being answered, that any issues they have in voting are able to be dealt with on the spot, before the voter drives away frustrated. And we're going to try to replicate that as much as we can in a socially distanced, safer a method of doing that, while still having people, able to assist voters, and certainly advertising. There's a hotline, the 866 Our Vote hotline, and a hotline for other languages, including a Native Vote hotline that we'll be putting up around polling places and advertising elsewhere to make sure people know who they can get in touch with to help with any voting issues. But that's going to be a shift. We're going to have to do things a little differently than we have done election protection in the past. And our county elections officials are also going to be administering elections a bit differently than they have in the past to adjust to the new reality.
So early voting for the August primaries just started not too long ago. Obviously, as things start progressing, I'm sure you're going to be dealing with a lot more to do. Obviously, I'm sure this is a busy time for you, as November will be the same, if not even more busy. I'm curious, what type of problems or situations are you preparing yourself to deal with throughout the actual voting process?
Yeah. So I think the problem that is at least most urgently on my mind right now is something I think people don't necessarily think of as a democracy or an elections issue, is evictions. The state and federal eviction protections are expiring in the next couple of weeks unless action is taken. And that's going to mean, obviously, tragedy for the families who are going to be kicked out of their homes, frankly, for no fault of their own, because the economy has disrupted the livelihoods of so many people. But it's also going to mean early ballots that are sent to mailboxes that the voter no longer lives at, right? It's going to mean voter registrations that are out of date because the address is old. And that's going to cause problems for voters. It's going to have more people likely showing up to vote in person at a time when we're trying to encourage anyone who can to vote by mail. And then when they do, it may take more time to correct those addresses Thankfully, a lot of our counties have the technology now to be able to update that on the spot, but that still takes time. And that's not the case everywhere in the state. And frankly, I'm worried that there are going to be a lot of people who are the most impacted by this crisis right now who will be left out of our political process, not just in this primary, but in November. I mean, we're going to have, I think, an eviction pandemic for at least as long as we have a COVID-19 pandemic because of how it affects the economy, unless we see those eviction protections extended. So to me, the most urgent policy ask for any officials for our state, obviously for the governor, could extend his eviction protections, and Congress could extend federal protections, is around eviction, not around anything that's necessarily specifically focused on elections. But that's my biggest fear at the moment. Thankfully, Arizona is a place where we've been voting by mail. Most voters vote by mail and have for a long time. And so it's not really so much of a huge adjustment like it is in other places. But there are real challenges because not everybody is going to be able to vote by mail, right? We know that if you live in rural Arizona, if you live especially on some rural tribal lands, there's very limited access to mail. You may be talking about driving many, many miles to get to a PO box that you share with multiple other families. And mail just takes so much longer to be delivered. There are people who have unstable housing. And as I was just mentioning, that's going to unfortunately be a growing segment of the population unless some action is taken. And so, while the vote by mail, I think, piece of our election infrastructure, doesn't have to see a whole lot of change. Counties are really working hard to make sure that they can provide in-person voting opportunities early right now and on election day for those who need it, and to do that safely. And that's a big challenge, frankly.
So regarding evictions and how they play into the election process, how quickly of a turnaround are we looking at of if a family or just single person gets evicted from their home, how quickly will they, theoretically get removed from being registered since they don't have an address?
So that's a great question. So it shouldn't be the case that anybody is removed from the rolls for being evicted. You're still a registered voter, and everybody has the right, who's eligible to be a registered voter, whether you have an address or not. So that's an important thing for people to know. But if your address is out of date and you go to vote in person, that could be an issue. If it doesn't say match what's on your driver's license, if you update one and not the other, or if your ballot is going to go to an address you don't live at anymore, obviously that's going to be a challenge for being able to vote that ballot. So it isn't that people will be removed from the rolls, thankfully, but there are some real hurdles that are created. And we see this all the time from people who move more often than average, which tend to be lower income families, that they are often eventually being removed from the rolls because mail is just not getting to them. But the way the system works, basically, election mail bounces back. If you miss a couple elections after that, then you're removed from the rolls. So we don't have to worry about that between now and November, but definitely about people just not getting their ballots, not getting other election information, knowing where their polling place is supposed to be if they're going to go vote in person. So that communication challenge, I think, is enormous. It's something that I don't think we should be putting on our elections officials, while they're also trying to make sure they can staff safe polling places. Instead, let's extend eviction protections to make sure that voters are protected, our elections officials at least don't have one other problem to worry about, and that we can have a fair election.
So I know you mentioned a couple times about vote by mail, and that's something that I do want to talk about. Obviously, it's a big topic of discussion that's been coming across this entire country with the president's opinions of it, and political split on a lot of the ideas around vote by mail. I'm curious, why do you think there's so much controversy surrounding this topic?
Yeah, I saw the president was tweeting some more misinformation about vote by mail just this morning. I reported this on Friday. And it's really odd from the perspective of Arizona, right? I don't think it is really a partisan issue among voters in Arizona, because most voters have been voting by mail for a long time. Republicans, Democrats, everybody, right? It's not that, not literally every voter, obviously, but the vast majority of voters in Arizona have been voting by mail in most elections for a long time now, without any incident, right? We know that it's a safe system. We know that your ballots are tracked from the moment they are ordered to the moment they're shipped to your house, to the moment they're received again by the election officials, and that signature is verified and then counted. It's a very transparent, safe and secure system that we've been using to vote, for a very long time, as have some other states. I think part of why it's become controversial maybe is that it's a little bit new in other places, aren't like Arizona, and so it's an opportunity to scare people, right? To confuse people and say, you might not know about this thing that they're doing over there in California or whatever, but here are all the reasons you should be afraid of it. I think we've got experience in Arizona to know that's just bunk, right? There's no need to be concerned about voting by mail. It's how we voted for a long time. It's how Governor Ducey, I know, gets an early ballot. We've seen photos of him dropping them off at a polling place. And because, elected officials, leaders of both parties, and voters of both parties, frankly, are accustomed to voting by mail.
What other things are you going to be paying attention to as the primary election gets closer? And then again, as I'm sure you're going to have to ramp up even more for the November election, as it's going to be one of the biggest elections in recent memory.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, we'll be watching to see how it goes at polling places. They're trying to, every county has a somewhat different strategy because the reality is just different from place to place. But are we able to have, and I'm confident we will, but fully staffed and safe polling places? And are there any things that we learned that need to be fixed for November to ensure that? I also think we're going to have some people who are voting by mail for the first time. Of course, that's always true, but especially, I think this election, we'll probably have some people voting by mail for the first time. And so concerns about making sure people know you're supposed to sign the ballot. There's not the ballot, the envelope that you put the ballot in, and that signature will be matched against your record before it's counted. There are always issues every election with signatures that the elections officials believe don't match what's on file, or where the envelope isn't signed at all. So I know we'll be working, as well as other organizations, to educate voters who are new to the vote by mail process. Maybe you're new to Arizona, about signing that ballot and where they can track the ballot to make sure that they know that it's been counted.
All right, that's all I had for you today, Joel. Thank you so much for joining me. Always appreciate your time, and stay healthy out there. I'm sure everyone's going to try to do the same thing, but again, appreciate it.
Absolutely, yeah, and more like stay healthy in here, not just with the pandemic, but also the weather.
Exactly.
But yeah, you too.